A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. I ain't sayin' nothin'. Just don't send me back. The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a sound Silas knew better than any human voice, a constant companion that scoured the land and the soul with equal indifference. His homestead was a lonely outpost against the vastness, a small cabin built of his own sweat and sorrow, hunkered down as if bracing for a blow that had already landed years ago. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and a silence that was heavier than any blanket. He moved through his chores with a deliberate, practiced economy, his shoulders weary from more than just the weight of split logs. Each swing of the axe, each draw of water from the well, was a repetition, a ritual to keep the ghosts at bay. He rarely went to town. The world of men held nothing for him now. Not since the small, unmarked mound on the hill behind the cabin had become the only thing he truly tended to. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. The dust motes danced in the pale winter sun slanting through the single grimy window, each one a tiny world unto itself, ignorant of the man who watched them without seeing. He had forgotten the shape of a smile. He had forgotten the sound of his own laughter. There was only the wind, the work, and the waiting, for what he no longer knew. The weekly stagecoach was a plume of dust on the horizon long before it was a reality. Silas only went for salt, flour, and coffee, the bare necessities that kept his body moving. He stood by the hitching post, his horse stamping impatiently, the sounds of the town, a distant clang of a hammer, the murmur of voices from the saloon, grating on his accustomed quiet. The coach rattled to a stop, the horses blowing hard. A few passengers disembarked, stretching their legs, their faces etched with the grime of the trail. But then the driver, a man named Henderson with tired eyes that had seen everything, climbed down and looked directly at Silas. He wasn't carrying a sack of flour. He was helping a woman down from the coach. She was thin, her dress worn down to a whisper of its original color, and she clutched the hand of a small boy whose eyes were wide with a silent, consuming fear. She kept her head bowed, her gaze fixed on the dusty ground as if the answers to all her troubles were written there. Henderson cleared his throat, a rough, uncertain sound. Silas, this is for you. He thrust a folded, yellowed piece of paper into Silas's hand. Silas didn't take it. He stared at the woman, then at the child. A bitter coldness, one that had nothing to do with the wind, seeped into his bones. I didn't order no one, he said, his voice a rusty hinge. Henderson shrugged, his expression a mixture of pity and duty. Came prepaid, from an agency back east. Said you were in need of a wife. The woman flinched at the word, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through her slight frame. The boy pressed closer against her leg. Silas finally took the paper. He unfolded it. The handwriting was a neat, clerical script, but a single, stark sentence was scrawled at the bottom in a different, rougher hand. You're not alone now. He crumpled the paper in his fist. A cruel joke. A mistake. Some other poor soul's misfortune delivered to his door. He turned to walk away, to get on his horse and ride back to the silence he had so carefully curated. But he stopped. He saw the woman shiver in the biting wind, her shawl offering no real protection. He saw the child's chapped lips. He saw the raw, exhausted terror in her posture, the rigid set of her spine that spoke of a person who had endured too much to break, but was worn down to the very last thread. A memory flickered. Another woman, another child, a winter that had taken everything. It was a ghost of a feeling, a pang of remorse over a loss so profound it had hollowed him out completely. He swallowed the anger. He turned back. He didn't say a word, just gave a short, sharp nod toward his wagon. It was an impulsive act, one that went against every instinct he had honed for years. He was a man who closed doors, yet he had just opened one. He didn't know why. He just did it. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. They were a pale, washed-out blue, filled not with hope, but with a deep, bottomless weariness. Then, with a quiet dignity that seemed impossible under the circumstances, She lifted the child into the wagon and climbed in after him. The town watched. He felt their stares like pinpricks on his skin. He loaded his supplies, his movements stiff and angry. He did not look at her again. The ride back to the homestead was a study in silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the relentless sigh of the wind. A new life had begun. The cabin, which had always felt empty, now felt suffocatingly small. The presence of the woman and the child filled every corner. Their silence a different vintage from his own. His was a silence of choice, a fortress. Hers was a thing of fear, a shield. Her name, he'd learned from the agency papers he'd finally read, was Alara. The boy was Leo. The papers also contained a single, stark addendum he'd missed in his initial anger. The woman is deaf. The words hit him not with pity, but with a sense of cosmic irony. He, who had no words left to give, had been sent a woman who could not hear them anyway. For 3 days, they moved around each other like wary animals. He gave her the single bed in the main room, its straw mattress rustling with her every tense movement. He took his bedroll to the barn, preferring the company of his horse and the frosty air to the palpable tension within those 4 walls. He would rise before the sun, stoke the fire in the main stove, and leave a pot of coffee brewing before retreating to his outdoor chores. When he returned for a midday meal, he would find a plate of food left for him on the small wooden table, a piece of bread, some salted pork. She would be in the far corner, mending a tear in the boy's shirt, her back to him. They never ate together. She and the boy ate when he was gone, their movements unobtrusive and swift, leaving behind only the evidence of a tin cup washed and a plate wiped clean. He watched her from a distance. She was not broken, he realized. She was exhausted. There was a deliberate calm in her hands as she worked, a quiet strength in the way she held her son. Her body a constant source of comfort for the boy who clung to her like a burr. She was always alert. When he entered the cabin, she would not hear the door, but she felt the vibration through the floorboards, the slight shift in the air. Her head would snap up, her eyes wide and assessing, before she would quickly lower her gaze again, making herself small. She was a survivor. He recognized the look. It was the same one he saw in his own reflection on the rare occasions he caught his own eye in a pane of glass. He chopped wood deep into the night, long after the need for it was met. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a release, a way to fight the turmoil churning inside him. He was splitting his guilt into pieces, trying to make sense of this intrusion. He hadn't asked for this. He had built his life on the foundation of being alone, and now this woman and child were a constant, silent reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had sworn never to risk again. One evening, he returned to the cabin later than usual, the slate evening sky already dark. A smoky lamp cast a warm, trembling glow inside. Through the window, he saw her sitting in the straight-backed chair by the fire, the boy asleep in her lap. She was stroking the child's hair, her expression one of such tender, aching love that it stopped him in his tracks. It was a look of pure, maternal dignity, a quiet defiance against the harshness of their world. In that moment, she was not a burden delivered to his doorstep. She was a mother protecting her child. The sight unlocked something in him, a rusty gear grinding into motion. He remained outside for a long time, the cold seeping into his coat, watching the small, quiet scene. It was a portrait of a home. It was a portrait of a life he had once known. He felt a profound sense of trespass, as if he were the intruder in his own house. The wall of his solitude, so carefully constructed, had just shown its first crack. He breathed. He began to notice the small details of their hardship. The soles of her shoes were worn through, the leather cracked and thin against the frosty ground. The boy's coat was threadbare at the elbows, offering little defense against the biting wind that seemed to find every gap and seam. These were not complaints she could make, not grievances she could voice. They were silent testaments to a long and difficult journey. His first intervention was clumsy, born of a grudging sense of responsibility he didn't want to acknowledge. He rode to town, the crumpled agency papers in his pocket. At the general store, he bought a pair of sturdy woman's shoes. the kind built for work in winter, and a small, thick wool coat for the boy. He endured the storekeeper's knowing smirk with a stony silence, his jaw tight. He was not a man who bought gifts. He was a man who bought supplies. The distinction felt important. He left the items on the porch before dawn, propped against the wooden door where she would be sure to find them when she went for water. He did not want thanks. He did not want a reaction. He just wanted the problem of her suffering to be less visible, less of a weight on the air in his own home. He watched from the barn as the sun rose. He saw the cabin door creak open. Alara emerged, bucket in hand, and froze. She stared at the new shoes and the small coat for a long, silent moment. She looked around the empty yard, her gaze scanning the barn, the trees, the horizon, searching for the source of this unexpected charity. He saw the suspicion in the set of her shoulders, the caution in her movements as she slowly crouched to touch the leather of the shoes. She did not snatch them up with gratitude. She examined them as if they might be a trap. Her response was not what he had expected, though he wasn't sure what he had been expecting. He had thought, perhaps, of a flicker of relief. Instead, he saw a deep, ingrained distrust of kindness. It was a look that said any gift came with a price she was not prepared to pay. She finally took the items inside. The door closed. A few minutes later, the boy, Leo, emerged onto the porch wearing the new coat. It was a little too big for him, but it was warm. He hugged himself, a small, tentative smile touching his lips as he looked up at his mother, who stood in the doorway. She did not smile back, but she placed a hand on his head, a gesture of quiet affirmation. That afternoon, Silas saw her old, worn-out shoes placed neatly by the woodpile. It was a silent message, though he wasn't sure what it meant. An offering? A trade? A quiet surrender of the old in favor of the new? He did not touch them. They remained there for days, a small monument to their unspoken arrangement. His help continued in this secret, unobtrusive way. He noticed the roof over her corner of the cabin dripped during a thaw. The next day, while she and the boy were inside, he climbed up and replaced the shingles, the sound of his hammer a deliberate, functional noise that required no explanation. He began leaving an extra apple or a piece of dried meat on the shelf where she stored their food, additions to the larder that were small enough to be overlooked, but substantial enough to make a difference. He was tending to them the way he tended to his livestock, providing shelter and sustenance, expecting nothing in return. It was a way to interact without interacting, to care without admitting he cared. He told himself it was practical. It was easier to live with people who were not actively freezing or starving. But deep down, a different truth was taking root. Their quiet, dignified presence was beginning to chip away at the ice around his heart. He found himself listening for the soft thud of her footsteps inside the cabin, noticing the way she arranged kindling in a neat, orderly stack. He was becoming aware of her, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person. And that awareness felt dangerous. It felt like the beginning of a thaw he was not ready for. He remained silent. He kept his distance. But something was growing in the quiet. It was fragile and tentative, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through frozen ground. It was hope. The sky had been a bruised purple for 2 days, the air unnerving in its stillness. Silas knew the signs. He had spent the day securing the barn, checking the seals on the cabin windows, and stacking a formidable wall of firewood against the exterior wall. A blizzard was coming. Not a simple snow, but a white fury that could erase the world for days. He worked with a grim urgency, the wind beginning to pick up, whining through the eaves of the barn. He didn't try to explain it to Alara. There was no way to convey the scale of what was coming through gestures. He could only prepare. When the first flakes began to fall, thick and heavy as wet ash, he brought in the last armload of wood and bolted the door. The world outside vanished. The wind began to howl, a living thing clawing at the cabin, and the oppressive silence inside was finally broken by the storm's rage. For the first day, they maintained their careful distance. The small cabin became their entire universe, the storm a roaring beast just outside the walls. Alara kept Leo close, reading to him from a tattered book she had carried with her, her fingers tracing words he could not hear but seemed to understand from her touch. Silas sat by the fire, sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a small, steady sound against the gale. But on the second night, something changed. Leo began to cough, a dry, ragged sound that echoed in the small space. By morning, a fever had taken hold. His face was flushed, his breathing shallow and quick. Alara's composure finally shattered. Her fear was a palpable thing, a frantic energy that filled the room. She held the boy, rocking him, her face a mask of desperation. She looked at Silas, her eyes pleading. She pointed to Leo, then to her own throat, her gestures sharp and panicked. She didn't have the words to ask for help, but her terror was a language he understood all too well. A cold dread washed over him, pulling him back to another time, another sick child, another storm. The memory was so vivid it stole his breath. He saw his wife, Sarah, her face pale with exhaustion, holding their infant daughter as a fever raged. He remembered the feeling of utter helplessness as the storm had trapped them. The doctor miles away, the world buried in snow. He had lost them both before the thaw came. The grave on the hill was a monument to his failure. He had frozen then, paralyzed by grief and fear. He would not freeze now. He pushed the ghosts away, his movements becoming deliberate and focused. He crouched by the boy, gently placing a calloused hand on his forehead. The skin was burning hot. He met Alara's terrified gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a promise. I will help. He rose and went to a small wooden chest in the corner, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside, beneath a folded baby blanket that still smelled faintly of lavender, were dried herbs. Yarrow to break the fever, mullein for the cough. Sarah had taught him about them, her voice full of the quiet wisdom of the land. He had packed them away with the rest of his past, wanting to forget. Now he brought them out into the light. He showed Alara how to crush the leaves and steep them in hot water, creating a bitter, steaming tea. He demonstrated how to soak a rag in cool water to place on Leo's forehead. She watched his every move, her initial panic receding into a focused intensity. They worked together without a word, a silent, synchronized team. He kept the fire roaring, melting snow for water. She administered the herbal remedies, her touch gentle and sure. They moved in the small space with a newfound purpose, their separate orbits finally merging into one. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was being weathered. The wall of silence between them remained, but it was no longer a barrier of distrust. It had become a space of shared effort, a quiet understanding forged in the crucible of a child's fever. He saw the fierce, unyielding strength of her love for her son. She saw the deep, unspoken well of his competence and a reliability that went beyond mere duty. As he watched her bathe the boy's face with a cool cloth, her expression a mixture of fear and ferocious tenderness, Silas felt the numb shell he had built around his heart begin to thaw. He was not just helping a stranger. He was fighting a ghost. And for the first time in years, he felt he might not be fighting it alone. The fever broke on the third day, as the blizzard's fury began to subside into a mournful, weary wind. Leo's breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep, his small hand curled in his mother's. The relief in the cabin was as tangible as the sudden quiet from outside. Alara watched her son, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, and when she finally looked up at Silas, her eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion he had never seen before. It was not gratitude, not exactly. It was something deeper. It was recognition. She slowly, hesitantly, reached out and touched his arm. Her fingers were light, a brief, trembling connection that conveyed more than 1,000 words could. Then she withdrew her hand, as if startled by her own boldness. He simply nodded, accepting the gesture for the profound communication it was. They had survived the storm, both the one outside and the one within. The world was still buried in white, a vast, pristine blanket that muffled all sound. The homestead felt like the last bastion of life on a frozen planet. Their supplies, already low before the storm, were now dangerously depleted. The coffee was gone, the flour nearly so. When the snow had hardened enough to support the weight of the wagon, Silas knew they would have to go to town. He dreaded it. He dreaded the prying eyes, the whispers, the way the townsfolk looked at him as if he were a ghost they'd forgotten to bury. Now he would not be alone. He would have Alara and Leo with him, their silent presence an open invitation for speculation and scorn. He tried to gesture to her, pointing to the empty flour sack and then toward the direction of the town. She understood immediately. A shadow passed over her face. The quiet confidence she had found during the storm receded, replaced by that familiar, guarded tension. She packed a small bag with a spare blanket for Leo and a piece of hardtack, her movements efficient and devoid of emotion. The journey was slow, the horses struggling through the deep drifts. The world was blindingly white, the sun on the snow a painful glare. Leo, wrapped in his new wool coat and an extra blanket, sat between them, his eyes wide with wonder at the transformed landscape. Alara sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her face a stoic mask. Silas felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. He was not a man who sought the company of others, but he felt a strange, unwelcome surge of protectiveness for the woman and child beside him. They were his responsibility. The thought was both a burden and, to his surprise, a comfort. The town of Redemption was slowly digging itself out. Men were shoveling paths, their breath pluming in the frosty air. As Silas guided the wagon down the main street, a hush fell over the activity. Heads turned. Eyes followed them. He could feel the weight of their curiosity. He pulled up in front of the general store, the largest and most central building, its porch a gathering place for the town's gossips. As he helped Alara down, he saw them clearly, the narrowed eyes of the women, the smirks of the men lounging near the door. He saw their gazes linger on her worn dress, on her silent, downcast face. They saw a mystery, a scandal. They did not see the woman who had fought for her son's life with a quiet, unyielding ferocity. A large, broad-shouldered man detached himself from the group on the porch and strode toward them. It was Fletcher, a land baron who owned half the county and carried himself with the smug assurance of a man who believed he owned the people in it, too. He had known Silas for years, and had always seemed to take a particular pleasure in his solitude, as if Silas's grief was a weakness he could exploit. Fletcher stopped in front of them, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Well, well, Silas," he boomed, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Finally decided to come back to the living. And you've brought company." His eyes raked over Alara, a dismissive, insulting appraisal that made her flinch and pull Leo closer. Silas felt a familiar, cold anger begin to build in his chest. He ignored Fletcher and moved to tie up the horses. He just wanted to get his supplies and leave. He wanted to return to the quiet of the homestead. But Fletcher was not a man to be ignored. He stepped into Silas's path. "Heard you got yourself a mail-order bride," Fletcher continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "A special one at that." The silent type, he laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Guess that suits a man like you." No one to argue back. The small crowd on the porch snickered. Alara could not hear the words, but she could read the tone. She felt the sting of their laughter and contempt like a physical blow. She lowered her gaze to the ground, her face pale, her arm a rigid bar holding Leo tightly against her side. She wanted to disappear, to shrink until she was nothing but a shadow they could no longer see. She had felt this kind of humiliation before. It was a familiar, bitter taste. She braced herself for it, for the world's casual cruelty. Silas looked at her. He saw her trembling, the way she tried to shield her son from the ugliness of the moment. He saw her dignity being stripped away by a bully's careless words. And in that instant, the dam of his carefully constructed indifference broke. All the grief, all the anger, all the years of suppressed pain surged forward, not as a wild rage, but as a cold, clear certainty. He had failed to protect his family once before. He would not do it again. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at Fletcher. His voice, when it came, was low and quiet, yet it cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a razor. "She's with me." The words were simple, a plain statement of fact, but they carried an undeniable weight. Fletcher's smile faltered for a second. He had expected Silas to shrink away, to retreat into his usual shell. "With you? I heard you bought her, Silas. Like a new saddle. Paid for and delivered." He gestured dismissively at Alara. "What's the matter? Didn't they tell you she was damaged goods? Can't even hear you cuss her out." The insult hung in the cold air. Alara squeezed her eyes shut. She did not need to hear to understand. Silas took a single step forward, placing himself squarely between Fletcher and Alara. He was not a large man, not like Fletcher, but there was a power in his stillness, a warning in his weathered, earthy presence. The crowd fell silent. He looked past Fletcher, his gaze sweeping over the watching faces on the porch, his voice rising just enough to carry. "Not bought," he said, his words deliberate and clear. Chosen. The word landed with the force of a physical blow. It was a declaration, a defense, a truth that even he hadn't fully realized until he spoke it aloud. He had chosen to let them stay. He had chosen to help them. He was choosing them now. He held Fletcher's gaze for a moment longer, a silent challenge that the bigger man, for all his bluster, was unwilling to meet. Fletcher grunted, a sound of frustrated anger, and turned away, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. The show was over. Silas turned his back on the silent crowd. He gently touched Alara's shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him with fear or suspicion or even gratitude. She was looking at him with a fragile, dawning trust. He nodded toward the store. "We'll get our supplies inside." The storekeeper was suddenly solicitous, his earlier smirk replaced by a hurried, nervous politeness. The whispers had stopped. Something had shifted. Silas had made a public declaration, drawing a line in the snow around the three of them. They were no longer just a man and his unfortunate wards. They were a unit. He paid for the flour, salt, and a small bag of peppermint candy he bought for Leo. As he led them out of the store and helped them back into the wagon, he was aware that the town was still watching. But the stares were different now. They were tinged with a grudging respect. He had spoken, and in the town of redemption, a silent man's words carried more weight than a loud man's boasts. The ride home was quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. It was not the silence of distance and distrust. It was the silence of shared experience, of a battle fought and won together. It was the beginning of peace. The setting sun painted the snow-covered landscape in hues of rose and lavender as they neared the homestead. The beauty of it felt different this time, not lonely, but serene. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the stove was a welcome embrace. Alara prepared a simple meal while Silas unhitched the horses. When he came inside, he found she had set 3 places at the small table. It was the first time. He hesitated for a moment, then sat down. They ate in their usual silence, but the air was no longer strained. Leo, munching happily on a peppermint stick, occasionally looked from his mother to Silas, a small, sleepy smile on his face. The child's simple acceptance was a bridge between them. After the meal, Alara put the sleeping boy to bed in the corner. Silas went outside, needing the cold air to clear his head. He stood on the small porch, looking out at the vast, starry sky. What had he done? The words he'd spoken in town, chosen, echoed in his mind. He had said them to defend her, to silence Fletcher. But as he stood there, he realized they were true. In some way he didn't fully understand. He had chosen this new, complicated life. The cabin door creaked open behind him. Alara stepped out onto the porch, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders against the evening chill. She stood beside him, not too close, but not as far as she would have before. They stood like that for a long time, 2 silent figures looking out at the immense, quiet world. The wind whispered through the dry grass poking up from the snow. From the distance came the lonely howl of a coyote. She was the one who broke the silence, though not with a sound. She touched his arm, her now familiar hesitant gesture. When he turned to look at her, she pointed a single, trembling finger toward the small hill behind the cabin, her expression a gentle question. She had seen the small mound of stones there. She had seen him go there sometimes, standing for long moments with his head bowed. He understood what she was asking. The secret of his sorrow, the source of his profound silence, was buried on that hill. He felt a sudden, sharp need to tell her, to make her understand. Words were useless, but he had other ways. He nodded slowly. He raised his hands, the calloused, work-worn hands of a farmer and a carpenter. He gestured to his own chest, then held up one hand, miming the height of a woman. Sarah. Then he lowered his hand, shaping it into the small, cradled form of a baby. His daughter, Lily. He pointed to the hill again, and then drew a finger across his own throat, a stark, simple gesture of finality. The fever, the storm, gone. A single, perfect tear escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't weep or make a sound. She simply understood. Her expression was one of such profound, shared sorrow that it pierced him to the core. She knew loss. She knew grief. She knew what it was to be alone in a harsh world. She saw the raw, suppressed pain he had carried for so long, the guilt that he had chopped into pieces with his axe day after day. He had confessed his greatest wound without speaking a single word. Then she did something that changed everything. She reached out, not just with a tentative touch, but with a deliberate, comforting grace. Her hand covered his on the porch railing. Her fingers gently squeezed. It was a gesture of forgiveness, of empathy, of solidarity. Said, "You are not alone in your pain. I see it. I understand." He looked down at her small hand covering his, and for the first time in 5 years, he did not feel the crushing weight of his guilt as a solitary burden. It was still there, a permanent part of him, but it was a weight that could, perhaps, be shared. He turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers. They stood there, connected by touch, their shared silence a testament to a bond that had grown in the most unlikely of soils. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were two survivors who had found a flicker of warmth in the long, cold winter of their lives. A new foundation was being laid. It was not built on promises or passion, but on the quiet, sturdy bedrock of mutual understanding. They had both endured, and now they would endure together. Winter slowly relinquished its icy grip. The snow receded, revealing the muddy, hopeful earth beneath. The sun grew warmer, its light lingering longer each evening. With the coming of spring, a palpable change settled over the homestead. It was no longer just a place of shelter and survival. It was beginning to feel like a home. The rigid routines of their early days softened into a comfortable, shared rhythm. Silas no longer slept in the barn. He had moved his bedroll to a corner of the main room, a silent acknowledgement that this was his home, too. They began to take their meals together as a matter of course, the silence at the table now companionable rather than tense. They learned to communicate through a unique language of gestures, expressions, and shared context. A nod from Silas in the morning indicated which field he would be plowing. A touch on the nearly empty wood box from Alara was a quiet request for more firewood. They moved around each other with an intuitive grace, anticipating each other's needs, their lives becoming interwoven threads in a single, strengthening cord. Silas found himself working with a renewed purpose. He was not just maintaining his solitude, he was building a future. He repaired the fence around the small vegetable garden, his hammer strokes ringing with a new energy. He cleared a new patch of land for planting corn, the sweat on his brow feeling honest and productive. He was working for them, for all of them. He began to see the world through new eyes. He noticed the way Leo's face lit up when he saw a jackrabbit dart across the field. He saw the quiet satisfaction on Alara's face as she tended the small herb garden she had planted near the cabin door. These small moments of life, of simple, quiet joy, were things he had been blind to for years. They were filling the hollow spaces inside him. One afternoon, he sat on the porch, watching Leo try to build a small tower of stones. The boy's brow was furrowed in concentration, his small hands clumsy but determined. On an impulse, Silas took out his whittling knife and picked up a block of soft pine. He began to carve. He worked slowly, deliberately, the shavings falling at his feet. As the shape emerged from the wood, he felt a forgotten sense of creation, of making something not out of necessity, but out of a simple desire to bring a small bit of happiness into the world. When he was finished, he held a small, smoothly carved wooden horse. He sanded it down with a piece of leather until it was perfect in his hands. He walked over to Leo and held it out. The boy looked up, his eyes wide. He reached out with a hesitant hand and took the horse. He stared at it, turning it over and over, his fingers tracing the carved mane and tail. A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. He looked up at Silas, and for the first time, the boy's smile reached his eyes. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated connection. Alara, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped out onto the porch. She looked at the horse in her son's hands, then at Silas. Her own smile was small and unsteady, but it was there. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile. And in that moment, the narrator speaks directly. Love is not always a bolt of lightning or a roaring fire. Sometimes it grows where no one is looking. It is a quiet, deliberate thing, like planting a seed in hard soil and tending it day after day. It grows in shared silence, in small gestures of kindness, in the steady, reliable presence of another soul. It takes root in the common ground of sorrow and blossoms in the sunlight of a shared, hopeful future. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. Silas didn't know the word for what he was feeling. He only knew that the constant, grinding ache in his chest had lessened. It had been replaced by something new, something warm and alive. He looked at Alara and Leo, the mother and child who had been sent to him like a piece of freight, and he saw his life. He saw his future. He went back to the porch and picked up another piece of wood, a much larger one this time. He had a new project in mind. He began to carve a rocker. The days lengthened into a warm, gentle summer. The corn grew tall in the field, and the vegetable garden thrived under Alara's patient care. The homestead, once a stark outpost of sorrow, was now alive with the quiet hum of a functioning life. Leo's laughter, a sound Silas could not hear but could feel in the joyful energy of the boy's movements, became a regular part of the day. He would chase butterflies, his small wooden horse always clutched in one hand. The rocking chair took shape slowly under Silas's hands. It became his evening ritual. After the chores were done and the sun had set, he would sit on the porch, the rhythmic scrape of his knife a peaceful, meditative sound. He was not just carving wood. He was shaping a promise. Each curve of the armrests, each slat of the back, was an investment in a future he had once believed was impossible. He was building a place for Alara, a symbol of comfort and permanence. He was building a place for her to rest. He found himself watching her more and more, not with the cautious assessment of the early days, but with a quiet admiration. He admired her resilience, the uncomplaining way she met every hardship. He admired her grace, the way she could create order and beauty from the simplest things. A jar of wildflowers on the table, a neatly patched quilt. She had brought a gentleness to his harsh world, a quiet light that had pushed back the shadows. One evening, as he worked on the final sanding of the rocker, she came and sat on the porch steps near him. She watched his hands work, her own hands resting in her lap. After a while, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and a stub of charcoal. She carefully drew something, her movements precise. When she was done, she held it out to him. It was a drawing of a house, not his cabin, but a larger one, with 2 windows and a curl of smoke coming from the chimney. Next to it, she had drawn 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a small child holding hands. It was a picture of a family, a picture of them. He looked at the drawing, then at her. Her expression was open and hopeful, a quiet question in her eyes. He took the charcoal from her and, on the same piece of paper, he drew a line extending from the side of the house, sketching in the shape of a new room. An addition, promise of growth, promise of staying. Her smile was like the dawn. He finished the rocker the next day. The wood gleamed with a soft, warm luster. It was a solid, honest piece of furniture, built to last. That evening, he brought it inside and placed it by the hearth, in the spot where she often sat with Leo. He did not say anything. He simply stepped back and gestured toward it. An offering. She approached it slowly, her hand tracing the smooth, curved back. She looked at him, her eyes shining, and then she sat down. She rocked gently, a slow, contented rhythm. The chair fit her perfectly. It was her place. In that moment, the cabin was no longer just his shelter that he was sharing. It was their home. Silas walked to the window and pushed it open, letting the warm evening air, fragrant with the scent of pine and damp earth, drift inside. It was a symbolic act, an opening to the future. He had bought a book in town weeks ago, a simple primer on sign language, and had been studying it in secret in the barn. He knew only a few signs, his clumsy fingers still struggling with the shapes. But he knew the ones that mattered. He turned back to her. He held up his hand and made the sign for stay. Then he brought his hands together to form the sign for homestay. Home. It was a question and a plea and a promise all in one. She stopped rocking. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. But she was smiling, a wide, radiant smile of pure, unadulterated joy. She nodded, a single, emphatic movement. Yes. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. Their journey had not been one of grand adventures or loud declarations, but of quiet moments, of gestures that spoke louder than words, of a love that had taken root in the most barren of ground and had, against all odds, blossomed. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Carry the memory of a silent man's courage, a deaf woman's dignity, and the small wooden horse that became a bridge between two lonely hearts. Remember that the deepest connections are often forged not in words, but in the quiet spaces in between. In a shared meal, a mended roof, a comforting hand in the dark. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most. Was it the moment he called her chosen, the quiet confession by the grave, or the final, simple sign for home? We'll see you again, where silence means home.